Mark Lowell had always considered his garage to be a kind of sanctuary, a quiet, grease-scented retreat from the rest of the world where nothing and no one could intrude. It was attached to his modest suburban home, a single-story place tucked away on a cul-de-sac where most people knew each other well enough to nod but not so well as to meddle. At least that had been the case until recently. The garage itself wasn't large, but every inch of it reflected his personality. Along one wall, neatly labeled shelves held decades' worth of carefully chosen tools. In one corner sat an old but well-maintained workbench scarred by years of mechanical tinkering. The centerpiece, however, was his most prized possession, a 1968 Triumph Bonneville, polished to a deep sheen that seemed to drink in the light and throw it back in warm, honey-colored glints. The bike had been his late uncle's, a man who had taken him for rides when he was a boy and planted in him the seed of a lifelong appreciation for the mix of art and engineering that made up classic motorcycles. That bike wasn't just a machine, it was a memory, a piece of family history, a reminder of days when the road ahead felt endless and the air smelled of gasoline, leather, and possibility. Mark's life followed a rhythm that suited him, opening his small vinyl record store downtown in the late morning, spending the afternoons helping customers rediscover old favorites or explore obscure albums, and returning home in the evening to unwind. In his garage, sometimes with a beer in hand, sometimes with the radio low, the soft crackle of a blues station mingling with the metallic clicks of his tools. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble or invited it into his life, and though his relationship with some of the neighbors was lukewarm at best, he had never had outright conflict with anyone. Still, there were certain people he preferred to avoid, chief among them a woman named Karen, who lived 2 houses down. Karen seemed to thrive on being involved in other people's business, often under the guise of keeping the neighborhood in order. She had a way of making simple interactions feel like interrogations, and Mark had learned to keep his responses polite, but brief whenever she approached. In the last few months, though, there had been subtle shifts in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Karen had been more visible, walking her dog in slow, deliberate loops past his house, occasionally stopping and glancing toward his garage with a look that was too intent to be casual. Mark had caught snippets of conversation between her and other residents. Nothing direct, but enough to pick up that his name came up more often than it should have. He dismissed it at first, chalking it up to idle gossip, and focused instead on his work and the projects waiting in his garage. It was easier to ignore the prickle of unease when he had something tangible in front of him, a carburetor to clean, a chain to oil, chrome to buff until it gleamed like liquid silver. Still, the garage was more than just a workspace. It was a symbol of control in his life, one of the few places where everything was exactly as he wanted it. He kept it locked at all times, double-checking the door before bed, and had never given anyone else a key. When he was inside, surrounded by the hum of the small fluorescent lights and the comforting smell of machine oil, it felt as if the outside world couldn't reach him. That sense of security wasn't something he took for granted. It was something he relied on, which was why, when the moment came that someone tried to breach it, the violation cut far deeper than a simple property dispute. It wasn't just about the bike, the tools, or the garage itself. It was about someone stepping uninvited into the one space that belonged entirely to him, and the realization that maybe the sense of safety he'd been holding on to had been an illusion all along. It was a little after 7 on a Tuesday morning when Mark's sense of routine was jarred in a way he had never experienced before. The air was still cool from the night, the kind of damp crispness that carried the faint smell of wet grass, and he had just stepped out onto his porch with a mug of coffee in hand. Normally at this time he would sit for a few quiet minutes before heading to the shop, letting his mind wander while the neighborhood slowly stirred awake. But as soon as his eyes drifted toward his driveway, his gaze caught on something that didn't belong. The garage door, which he had locked the night before, was standing wide open. For a moment, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. The image didn't make sense. He could clearly remember pulling the door shut, hearing the metal latch click into place, and even giving it a tug to be sure it was secure. And yet, here it was, gaping like a pulled tooth, revealing the dim interior that should have been hidden from view. At first he thought it might be some sort of fluke. Maybe he had been distracted, maybe the lock had slipped. But before he could finish the thought, he noticed movement inside. 2 men in reflective vests were in the garage, bent over his Triumph. One was crouched low, working a strap around the front wheel, while the other tugged at a thick nylon tie securing the frame. Behind them, just outside the driveway, was a flatbed tow truck with its ramp already lowered, the hydraulic winch humming softly. It was a surreal sight, as if he had stepped into someone else's morning. The men moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done this 100 times, their faces blank, their eyes avoiding his. And then there was Karen. She stood off to the side of the driveway, a tablet clutched in both hands, recording the scene with an expression that straddled smug satisfaction and forced righteousness. She was dressed immaculately, as though this were an event worth dressing up for, her voice projecting across the yard in that slightly too loud tone she used when she wanted to make sure others overheard. "She's been warned about improper storage," she said, not to Mark but to the screen of her device, as if narrating to an invisible audience. "It's a safety issue. This vehicle is being removed in accordance with neighborhood rules." The words hung in the morning air like an accusation wrapped in bureaucracy, their neat phrasing designed to sound official even though no one had asked her to explain anything. Mark felt a pulse of heat rise through his chest, a mix of disbelief and anger. But he didn't charge forward or shout. Years of dealing with difficult customers and petty disputes in business had taught him the value of control, and his instincts told him this was not a moment to let emotion dictate his actions. He set his coffee down on the porch railing, walked down the steps, and positioned himself between the tow truck and the garage. The man working the winch glanced at him briefly, then went back to his task as though Mark were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Stop what you're doing," Mark said, his voice steady but edged with steel. "This is my property, and you have no right to take it." The taller of the 2 men finally straightened up, wiping his hands on his vest. He produced a crumpled sheet of paper and held it out. "We've got an order," he said flatly. Mark took the paper, scanning it quickly. It bore the name of a supposed local enforcement body, but there were no signatures, no stamps, no letterhead beyond a cheap inkjet logo at the top. The language was vague, referring to non-compliant storage of motorized vehicle and imminent relocation for community safety. Nowhere did it specify the authority granting this order, and nowhere did it reference any legal code or ordinance. He handed it back without a word and turned his attention to Karen, who was still recording. "Did you organize this?" he asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she gave a thin smile and said, "If you'd addressed the problem when you were first notified, we wouldn't be here." There was no "we" here, Mark thought. No shared responsibility. This was an ambush. He could feel the beginnings of a trap closing in, a situation engineered to provoke him into reacting badly. Instead of giving them what they wanted, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the non-emergency police line. His voice calm as he explained that 2 men were attempting to remove his motorcycle without valid documentation, and that the garage had been entered without his consent. As he spoke, he noted the truck's license plate, the company name stenciled on the door, and the faces of the men, locking every detail into memory. The tow operators began to look uneasy, their glances flicking between him and the idling truck. Karen muttered something about delaying official action, but took a small step back, as if she knew the tide was shifting. Within minutes, the distant hum of an approaching patrol car drifted down the street. The men paused their work, and Mark felt the taut coil of tension in his chest ease slightly. Whatever this was, it was about to be dragged out into the open, and while he didn't yet know the scope of it, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Someone had orchestrated this morning, and it hadn't been by mistake. The open garage, the falsified order, the tow truck waiting as if on cue. None of it was random. It was the first overt move in something larger, and it had just landed on his doorstep. The arrival of the patrol car did not so much diffuse the situation as force it into a strange, suspended state. A moment where everyone was waiting to see which way the weight would tip. The two tow operators stepped back from the Triumph, their hands raised slightly in that practiced gesture of people who wanted to convey compliance without admitting fault. Karen kept her tablet raised, though she was no longer narrating. Instead, her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between Mark and the officers as they approached. The patrol car had stopped halfway up the drive, blocking the tow truck from leaving without scraping its flank against the cruiser, and the low rumble of both idling engines filled the cool morning air with a mechanical tension. Mark stayed where he was, standing between the open garage and the street, letting the officers come to him. He explained in precise detail what he had found when he stepped outside that morning: the open garage door, the two men in reflective vests securing straps to his motorcycle, the unverified paperwork, and the fact that he had not given anyone permission to enter his property. One of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a slow, deliberate way of speaking, asked to see the order the tow operators claimed to have. The paper changed hands, and Mark watched as the officer's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes narrowing in recognition that something was off. He asked the men where they had gotten the work order, and their responses were as vague as the document itself. "It came through the company. We just do what we're told. It's all in the system." Karen interjected, her tone sharp now, insisting that there had been repeated notices sent to Mark about the improper storage of the motorcycle, and that she had personally observed safety violations. When pressed by the second officer, a younger woman with a clipped, businesslike manner, she couldn't produce any of these supposed notices, claiming instead that they were on file with the neighborhood board. Mark could feel the pull of the conversation, the subtle way Karen was trying to redirect the focus from the intrusion itself to an argument about compliance, but he resisted the bait. He had learned that in these situations, the person who stayed closest to the facts was usually the one who came out ahead. The officers eventually told the tow operators to remove the straps from the motorcycle and step away from the property until the validity of the order could be confirmed. The men complied without protest, but Mark noticed the quick, knowing glance they exchanged before retreating to the truck. It wasn't the look of people who had made an honest mistake. It was the silent communication of those who understood this was only a temporary setback. The garage door was closed and resecured, and the officers advised Mark to keep it locked and to report any further attempts to remove his property. There were no arrests, no tickets, just a vague promise that the matter would be looked into. As the patrol car pulled away, Karen lingered on the sidewalk, the tablet now lowered at her side. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "If you just cooperated, it would be over by now." Mark didn't answer. He simply held her gaze for a long moment before turning his back and walking into the house. It was not lost on him that she had been present from the start, or that the tow truck had been positioned perfectly for a quick load and go. There was no plausible scenario in which she had simply been out for a morning stroll and stumbled onto the event. The rest of the day at the shop passed in a haze of unease. Between customers, Mark replayed the morning over and over in his head, cataloging details, filing away the expressions and movements of everyone involved. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this had been orchestrated with the expectation that he would not be there to stop it. The choice of early morning, the lack of proper documentation, the presence of Karen to provide a veneer of local legitimacy, it had all been calculated. What troubled him most was the knowledge that they had gotten into the garage in the first place. He inspected the door that evening and found faint scratches around the lock, the kind made by someone who knew how to work a pick quickly and without leaving obvious signs. Whoever had done it wasn't a first-timer. That night he took additional precautions. He replaced the padlock on the garage with a heavier tamper-resistant model and installed a simple but effective wedge bar across the inside of the door. He didn't delude himself into thinking it was impenetrable, but it would buy him time if someone tried again. He also began keeping a notepad by the front door, jotting down the dates and times of any unusual activity around the house. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about building a record, something objective that could later be shown to someone who might actually do something about it. But even with these measures, a new layer of awareness had settled over him, a sense that his home was no longer just his. Every unfamiliar sound outside drew his attention. Every slow-moving vehicle on the street made him pause. He noticed Karen twice that week, once standing at the far end of the block pretending to scroll through her phone, and once speaking in low tones to a man he didn't recognize, gesturing faintly toward his house. The man nodded once and walked away without looking back. Mark knew then that the attempt to take his motorcycle had been only the opening move. They had tested his defenses, gauged his reactions, and now they would adapt. The thought didn't fill him with fear so much as with a grim resolve. If they were going to escalate, they would find that he was not nearly as easy a target as they might have imagined. 2 weeks passed before the next turn in the situation revealed itself, and by then Mark had almost convinced himself that the incident with the tow truck might have been a one-off attempt that had failed badly enough to discourage a repeat. The new locks on the garage still shone with their factory polish, and the wedge bar remained in place every night without a scratch to suggest tampering. But beneath that surface calm there was an itch in his mind, a quiet awareness that nothing about the original event had been random. It was a little after 9 on a Thursday evening when the proof came, arriving in a plain white envelope slipped under his front door while he was in the kitchen making coffee. The envelope bore no return address, only his name in blocky, uneven handwriting. Inside was a photocopy of a document titled Voluntary Relocation Agreement, with his own name and signature scrawled at the bottom, only it was not his handwriting, and the signature had the clumsy, mechanical feel of something traced or copied. The body of the document stated that he had consented to the temporary storage of his motorcycle at an off-site facility for safety and compliance reasons. Below that, in smaller print, it claimed that he had been present when the arrangement was made. The date listed was the same as the morning of the attempted tow. He stared at the paper for a long time, not in shock, but in a kind of cold, clinical disbelief. The forgery wasn't even particularly good, which meant it wasn't intended to stand up to scrutiny in a courtroom. Its purpose was something else, likely to create the illusion of legitimacy in the eyes of someone who wouldn't bother to dig deeper. He thought about the patrol officers from that morning, about how easily one could be swayed by a document that looked official enough at first glance. He also thought about Karen, standing there with her tablet, positioning herself as a witness to his supposed compliance. It wasn't difficult to imagine her producing this forged paper if she had been asked to justify her involvement. The next morning, Mark decided it was time to get an independent opinion from someone who understood more about property law than the average beat cop. He called a former customer of his shop, a man named Ray Kendall, who ran a small legal practice a few miles away. Ray wasn't a close friend, but they had bonded over a shared love of old blues records, and Mark trusted him enough to know he'd get a straight answer. When Mark arrived at his office, Ray read through the forged agreement slowly, his expression tightening as he went. "This is bad," he said finally, placing the paper flat on his desk. "Not because it's convincing, honestly, it's sloppy, but because it's clearly part of a larger attempt to establish a paper trail. Someone's building a case against you, and they're not worried about whether the documents could survive a real legal challenge. They're counting on intimidation, and on you not having the resources or energy to fight." Ray advised him to make an official police report about the forgery, but also to avoid directly confronting the people he suspected of being behind it. If you corner them, they'll just adjust their tactics. Better to have a record of everything, and let them make the next move where we can catch them in the act, he said. It was sound advice, and Mark followed it. That afternoon, he filed the report, handing over the forged agreement and explaining the circumstances of the original garage intrusion. The officer at the desk was polite but non-committal, promising that the information would be added to the file. Mark left the station with the uneasy sense that the file was exactly where the matter would remain unless something more dramatic happened. That something came sooner than he expected. 3 nights later, as he was closing up the shop, his phone buzzed with a text from his next-door neighbor, Alicia, a quiet woman who worked from home and rarely involved herself in neighborhood disputes. The text was short. Saw people near your garage. Didn't look familiar. Mark drove home faster than he should have, but when he arrived, the street was empty, the garage door still shut and locked. He checked the new padlock, no damage, but when he walked around to the side of the garage, his flashlight beam caught a small metallic glint in the grass. He crouched and picked up what turned out to be a lock shim, the kind used by locksmiths to slip open certain types of padlocks without a key. It was worn and slightly bent, as if it had been dropped mid-use. Finding the shim was a turning point. It was the first piece of physical evidence that whoever was behind this was still actively trying to get inside. He took photos of it in place before picking it up, then put it in a small plastic bag. He texted the photo to Ray and Alicia, letting them know he had evidence of attempted entry. Ray responded immediately, urging him to hold on to it in case it could be tied to someone later. Alicia's reply was more cautious. Be careful. I've been seeing a dark SUV drive by slow every night around 10. That detail stuck in Mark's mind. A dark SUV could be anyone, but combined with the shim and the forged document, it painted a picture of persistence, not chance. He decided to make one more change. He installed a motion-activated light above the garage door, bright enough to flood the driveway and street if anyone approached at night. It wasn't about catching them in the act with his own hands. It was about making the attempt as visible and risky as possible. The following evening, just after 9, the new light clicked on. Mark was in the kitchen and saw the sudden glare through the blinds. By the time he reached the window, a vehicle was already rolling away, its brake lights flashing briefly as it turned the corner. He couldn't make out the license plate, but the shape and height of the rear matched Alicia's description of the SUV. He stood there for a long time after it was gone, thinking about the pattern forming. They weren't just looking for an opening. They were testing his responses, learning his habits. And that meant the next move, when it came, would be bolder. In that moment, he understood that the problem had grown beyond the theft of a motorcycle. The forged documents, the repeated intrusion attempts, the surveillance, they were pieces of a strategy designed to corner him, to create a version of events in which he was the one in the wrong. The realization was sobering, but it also solidified something inside him. He was no longer just defending his property, he was defending his name, and he would not let them write his story for him. Mark had been expecting another quiet stretch before whoever was behind the harassment made their next move. But instead, the escalation came abruptly and without any attempt to disguise its intent. It began on a Monday morning with a thick envelope shoved into his mailbox marked "Notice of Penalty" in heavy, all-caps type across the front. Inside was a letter that read like a legal decree, but with the same strange mixture of vagueness and false authority he had seen before. The language accused him of willful obstruction of lawful retrieval and continued non-compliance with agreed terms of relocation, and it demanded payment of a fine that was several $1,000s, more than enough to feel threatening, but just low, enough to suggest it could be easier to pay than fight. The fine was accompanied by an itemized list of supposed administrative costs, each one absurdly inflated, and at the bottom was a line warning that failure to pay could result in immediate collection of assets to satisfy the outstanding debt. It was a threat, plain and simple, and it was carefully worded to sound like the next tow truck could be arriving any day. By itself, the letter might have been dismissed as another empty gesture. But later that afternoon, a different kind of pressure appeared. As Mark pulled into his driveway after closing the shop, he noticed 2 neighbors, people who had always been polite, if distant, standing near the curb, talking in low voices. They didn't greet him, didn't make eye contact, and as he walked toward his front door, he caught just enough of their conversation to hear his name and the phrase, "not what it looks like." The implication was clear. Someone was spreading a story about him, and judging by their discomfort, it wasn't flattering. It didn't take much imagination to guess who would be behind such a rumor campaign. Karen had both the motive and the personality for it, and she had already shown a willingness to insert herself into situations that didn't concern her if it meant she could wield even a sliver of authority. The rumors were soon accompanied by smaller, more targeted provocations. Twice in the same week, Mark found trash scattered across his driveway early in the morning. Old fast food wrappers, coffee cups, even an empty oil container that looked like it had been deliberately tipped over to stain the pavement. Once could be random. Twice in quick succession was unlikely to be coincidence. On the third occasion, the trash wasn't just strewn about. It was piled directly against the garage door in a way that made it impossible to open without first cleaning up the mess. The placement felt deliberate, a message that whoever was doing this was willing to come right up to his property line and leave evidence of their presence. The tension ratcheted higher one night when Alicia texted again to say she had seen a man standing across the street from his house, leaning against a lamppost and staring in the direction of the garage. She said he stayed there for several minutes before walking away toward the intersection, disappearing into the shadows without speaking to anyone. Mark checked his locks twice that night and found himself waking at every small sound, the stillness of the street no longer offering the comfort it once had. He relayed all of this to Ray the next day, and Ray's response was measured but serious. "They're trying to box you in from two sides," he said. "On one hand, they're manufacturing a paper trail to justify taking the bike. On the other, they're creating a social environment where your neighbors either believe you're in the wrong or won't care enough to get involved. That way, when something happens, you're isolated." Ray suggested he start documenting the social fallout as well. Names, dates, and any overheard comments, because in disputes like this, perception often mattered as much as facts. Mark took the advice to heart. He kept his phone in his pocket whenever he was outside, not to film confrontations but to jot quick notes immediately after anything suspicious. The notes began to form their own grim pattern, with sightings of the dark SUV becoming more frequent and usually coinciding with other minor incidents, like his trash cans being knocked over, or a stranger walking slowly past his property while talking on a phone and glancing toward the garage. It was the persistence that unnerved him most. This wasn't the frantic push of someone trying to resolve a single grievance. It was the steady pressure of a group that knew exactly what it wanted and was prepared to erode his resistance over time. The clearest sign yet that they were willing to push harder came late on a Friday evening. Mark had stayed later than usual at the shop, reorganizing inventory, and as he turned onto his street, he noticed the motion light above his garage flashing on and off repeatedly. His first thought was that it might be a wiring issue, but as he got closer, he could see that the garage door was vibrating slightly, as though something heavy was leaning against it from the inside. He parked quickly, leaving the car door open, and walked up to find the lock still intact but the wedge bar inside dislodged and lying on the floor just past the threshold. Someone had been inside, and they had left in a hurry. He stepped back, scanning the street, and caught sight of a vehicle at the far end, dark, high-sided, and idling for a moment before turning away. The license plate was obscured by mud. He didn't try to chase it. He knew there was no point. Instead, he locked the garage again, set the wedge bar back in place, and called Ray, his voice low and controlled as he described what he'd found. Ray's answer was immediate. "This is the point where you stop assuming they'll play within any kind of rules. From here on, you have to be ready for them to try again with less caution." That night, Mark didn't sleep much. The fine notice, the rumors, the trash, the sightings of strangers and vehicles, they were no longer isolated pieces. They were parts of a single, deliberate campaign. And the campaign's goal was no longer just to get his motorcycle. It was to push him to a breaking point where a mistake on his part would make their job easier. The realization was sobering. but it also clarified his next step. He couldn't just react to them anymore. He had to start anticipating them, because if he didn't, the next time they came for the bike, they might succeed. The breaking point arrived on a damp, windless night that seemed designed to muffle sound and swallow movement. Mark had been in the living room, half watching the end of a late movie, when the motion light above the garage clicked on. This alone wasn't unusual anymore. There had been enough false triggers from passing animals or swaying branches that he no longer jumped at every flash, but within seconds it clicked on again, then again, the rhythm too deliberate to be chance. He muted the television and stayed still, listening. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of metal scraping against metal reached him from outside, followed by the hollow thunk of something striking the garage door. Whoever it was, they were working the lock with patience and confidence. This time, he didn't storm outside to confront them. He moved quietly into the hallway and picked up the cordless phone, dialing the direct line Ray had given him to a detective he occasionally worked with on fraud cases. In a low voice, Mark explained what was happening in real time, emphasizing that he suspected it was connected to the ongoing forgery and harassment. The detective didn't hesitate. He said a patrol unit was already nearby and would be there in minutes, advising Mark to remain inside and unseen until they arrived. Mark eased to the front window and peered through a narrow slit in the blinds. In the weak halo of the motion light, he could see 3 figures. 2 in the same kind of reflective vest the tow operators had worn before, and a third in a dark jacket and baseball cap, crouched low at the garage door. The man in the jacket was clearly the one working the lock, his hands moving in short, practiced motions. The other 2 stood in a half circle, one holding a clipboard, the other glancing up and down the street. The setup was disturbingly organized, and it confirmed what Mark had feared. This wasn't an impulsive theft. It was an operation. The distant murmur of an approaching engine drew closer, but the trio outside either didn't notice or assumed it was just another neighbor returning home. Only when the patrol car swung abruptly into the driveway, blocking their escape, did the man at the lock drop his tools and the others step back with their hands raised in mock innocence. The officers moved quickly, separating the 3 and securing the scattered lockpicking tools in plastic evidence bags. Mark stayed inside until one of the officers signaled for him to come out. As he stepped into the light, he saw Karen standing on the far sidewalk, arms crossed, her expression caught between irritation and disbelief. She hadn't been part of the group, at least not physically, but her presence was no accident. The officers took statements on the spot, photographing the garage door, the lock, and the tools. One of them quietly told Mark that the clipboard held more than blank forms. It contained copies of the same forged relocation agreements he had already reported, each with a different resident's name. His was at the top of the stack. There was no need for speculation now. This was evidence, direct and tangible. The men were detained, and the officers promised that the incident would be linked to the earlier report and the forgery complaint. Mark didn't bother speaking to Karen. He simply met her eyes for a moment, long enough for her to realize that whatever influence she thought she had over the situation had just been broken. When the patrol car pulled away with the 3 suspects inside, the street felt unnaturally still, as though even the air was waiting to see what would happen next. Mark resecured the garage, this time with a new chain running through the frame of the Triumph, and stood for a long moment in the center of the room, breathing in the familiar smell of oil and metal. The bike was still his, but the night had made it clear that keeping it safe had never been just about locks and doors. It was about refusing to let someone else decide what belonged to him. In the days that followed the arrests, the neighborhood seemed to undergo a subtle but unmistakable shift. The slow-moving SUV stopped appearing at night, the piles of trash by his garage vanished, and the sidelong glances from certain neighbors began to soften, replaced by hesitant nods or quick greetings. Word had spread quickly that the 3 men caught outside his garage were linked to similar incidents in other parts of the city, targeting properties with valuable items and backing their thefts with forged documents meant to intimidate owners into surrendering without a fight. The fact that those documents had been found in the possession of the suspects left no doubt about the intent, and the inclusion of his name at the top of the list made it clear just how close they had come to succeeding. Mark's meetings with the detective and Ray confirmed what he had already suspected about Karen's role. While there was not enough evidence to tie her directly to the lockpicking or the forged signatures, her communications with one of the suspects, captured through phone records and neighbor testimony, were enough to damage her credibility. Permanently, she stopped attending community meetings and was seen less often outside her home, her once confident stride replaced by quick, purposeful walks that avoided eye contact. It wasn't the public reckoning Mark might have imagined in his angrier moments, but it was enough to end her influence over the neighborhood. For Mark, the resolution came not in the form of a grand victory, but in the quiet, almost anticlimactic realization that his home once again felt like his. The garage door closed with the solid, reassuring thud he knew so well. The locks clicked into place without the tension of wondering how long they would hold, and the Triumph sat gleaming under its cover, untouched. He had strengthened the security, yes, but more importantly, he had dismantled the false narrative being built around him before it could trap him. The campaign against him had failed, not because he had fought with louder accusations or public scenes, but because he had documented, waited, and forced the truth into the open where it could not be ignored. Standing in the doorway of the garage on a warm evening, the faint smell of rain still in the air, he understood that while the bike was what they had tried to take, the real battle had always been over control, and in that, he had won.